Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update on China. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that China has been in a state of turmoil for the last 12 months or so, partly as a result of problems that were building in the property sector that was fueling the growth in the economy over the course of the last 10 years or so, and partly because of the zero-tolerance COVID policy that was being followed by the government up until a couple of months ago. But we've now received 3 sets of data, all of which are very concerning from China's point of view. Firstly, with regards to the property sector, 2022 saw the lowest level of investment in any year since 1999. Secondly, the GDP figure for the full year has now been released, and 3% growth is the worst that China has seen, excluding the COVID-19 pandemic, since 1976. And thirdly, and possibly most concerning of all, 2022 saw the first contraction in the Chinese population since 1961. So in today's video, we'll go through the GDP figures in more detail and see what's going on with regards to the economy. We'll have a look at what's happening in the property sector and what this means for the Chinese economy. And then we'll have an in-depth look at what's going on with population, what's driving this reduction, and what the implications of that are for the Chinese workforce and the Chinese economy. So before we get started on all of that, if I could ask you for a thumbs up at some point during this video if you're enjoying the content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I always include chapters, so if you don't have time to watch everything, you can pick and choose what you'd like to see. And if you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to YouTube Super Thanks and membership, as well as Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. And once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that has supported the channel. I really appreciate it. And for regular viewers, you may have spotted that I've changed the lighting setup slightly today, so please let me know what you think. There will be some more changes coming. This is just the start of it. I'm actually waiting for some more lights to arrive so I can actually do the full change, but some of them have already turned up, so I thought I'd implement some changes today and see what the feedback is. The full-year GDP in China for 2022 increased by 3%, which represented a serious shortfall compared with the official target of 5.5%, and was significantly lower than the 8.4% growth achieved in 2021. Excluding 2020, when the Chinese economy, along with the rest of the world, was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, this was the single worst performance since 1976, which was the final year of the decade-long Cultural Revolution that had serious implications for the Chinese economy. On a quarterly basis, GDP stalled, coming in at a flat 0% in the fourth quarter, compared with growth of 3.9% in the July to September quarter. And this chart shows the quarterly movements in GDP dating back to 2011. The red line shows the percentage compared against the previous year, and the orange line shows the percentage movement quarter by quarter. And what this chart clearly shows is that between 2011 and 2022, there has been a continuous slowdown in the growth of GDP. Back in 2011, the annual GDP growth was above 10%. And excluding the severe dip and spike on this chart caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, you can see a clear linear progression downwards to the current rate of around 3%. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, well, 3% GDP growth actually doesn't sound too bad. It's not exactly a recession. But you need to put that figure into context. Firstly, we need to look at the historical rates over the long term. And secondly, we need to talk about what's going on with regards to the Chinese economy, because it's still developing. Even though it's the second largest economy in the world, it's not fully developed. It's still growing. And therefore, it should be achieving higher rates of growth than 3%. This chart shows the movement in Chinese GDP dating back to the early 90s. GDP growth at the start of the 90s hit an incredible 15%, and despite coming down slightly, China achieved growth of between 7 and 10% in every year between 1998 and 2004. Between 2004 and 2007, growth rose back up to 15%, and even during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, China was still achieving growth of 6 or 7%. In 2010, GDP growth rose to around 12%. However, as you can see from the chart, since 2010, China has been on a downward trend, and the rate of growth in GDP has been slowing year on year, and this obviously represents a major cause for concern. China's property investment fell by 10% year on year in 2022, which is the first decline since records began in 1999. And the full year figure compares with a decline of 9.8% in the first 11 months of the year, indicating that the slowdown in investment is ongoing. Property sales by floor area dropped by more than 24% in 2022 compared with the year earlier, which is also the largest fall since data was made available in 1992. And the full year figure is also higher than the previous figure for the 11 months, indicating a continued slowdown. New construction starts measured by floor area declined by over 39% year on year, and funds raised by Chinese property developers reduced by almost 26%. And this chart shows the monthly movements in new house prices, and the housing market in China is entirely dominated by new properties. There is very little secondary trading. Everybody wants to buy a new apartment. And you can see that prices fell by 1.5%, which is the 8th consecutive month that prices have been falling. So obviously there are major problems in the property sector right now in China, and this is a major problem for the Chinese economy. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that property equates to around 25% of GDP. Over the course of the last 20 years, property has been the main engine, the main driver for the Chinese economy. When everything was deregulated, the population of China were given the opportunity to buy property as an investment. And this became very popular. And as it became more popular, prices started to rise, people started to make more money from the investments, and so it became a self-fulfilling circle. Property was seen as a no-risk gamble. It was a gold rush. Everybody wanted to put their life savings into property. And as a result of that, large property development businesses grew up all across China, and these companies constructed whole towns and cities. But in 2019, the authorities decided to bring in a new policy called the Three Red Lines to make sure that the property developers were not overstretching themselves and taking on too much debt. And unfortunately, a lot of the businesses had done exactly that. And the Three Red Lines policy meant that those companies could no longer access any of their debt, and it resulted in a complete slump in the sector. A lot of companies had to down tools and stop building, and at the same time as that happened, we had the COVID lockdowns all across China. Now, this meant that a lot of people didn't get their apartments that they'd paid in full for, and that caused a confidence crisis all across China with regards to property. And the current set of results show that that crisis is still ongoing. We've seen a fall in investment levels, we've seen a fall in the amount of money that property developers are raising, and we've seen a fall in prices. And until this situation sorts itself out, it will undermine the economy of China, because when you've got 25% of your GDP dependent on one sector, and that sector goes into a slowdown, then that's going to drag down your overall results. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening with GDP right now. China's population in 2022 fell for the first time in 6 decades, a historic turn that is expected to mark the start of a long period of decline in citizen numbers with profound implications for its economy and the world. China's National Bureau of Statistics reported a drop of around 850,000 people for a population of 1.4 billion in 2022, marking the first decline since 1961, the last year of China's Great Famine. This chart shows the annual change in the population of China between 1950 and 2022. And as you can see, the only 2 years apart from 2022 when there was a reduction in the population were 1960 and 1961. And that was as a result of the Great Famine in China. So this wasn't a demographic trend at that time. It was a one-off event. And if you look at the trend of this chart, you can see that between 1950 and 1970, there was a continued increase in population numbers. And the population of China was increasing between 10 and 20 million every single year. However, between 1970 and 1980, the population growth slowed back down from around 20 towards 10 million. And then interestingly, between 1980 and 1987, the population growth figures started to increase again, which is slightly surprising because in 1980, the one-child policy was introduced, whereby families were penalised if they had more than one child. And that policy stayed in place until 2015. And you can see the long-term impact of that policy as the increase in population started to reduce year on year. Now, that policy was actually removed in 2015, and you can see that there was a slight increase in the population numbers. However, the longer-term trend between 1990 and where we are today was a slowdown in the annual increase. However, the reduction in 2022 is the first time that the demographic trend has led to a fall in the population. And this chart shows the birth rate in China dating back to 1950. The scale on the left-hand side are the number of births per 1,000 people. So back in 1950, the number of births per 1,000 was around 37. However, as you can see, over the last 70 years, there's been a significant decrease in the birth rate, and it's currently running at 6.7 per 1,000 people. And to put the current birth rate in China into perspective, this table ranks all of the countries in the world by birth rate. And you can see that the country with the highest birth rate right now is Angola, with 43.7 births per 1,000 people, followed by Niger with 43.6, Mali, Chad, Uganda, Zambia, Burundi, Malawi, Somalia, and Liberia, which is coming in at 37.9 births. Scrolling further down the list and picking out a few countries as we go along the way, Iraq has 30 births per 1,000 people, Pakistan 21.6, Syria 20.7, Malaysia 18.8, India 18.7, Argentina 16.5, Indonesia 15.9, Turkey 15.4, Sri Lanka 14.8, Ireland, which has one of the highest birth rates in Europe, 13.8, New Zealand 13.1, United States 12.4, and the United Kingdom and Australia 12. This chart shows the countries with the highest death rate per 1,000 in the years between 2015 and 2020. So this was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I would guess that if we were updating this today, Ukraine may be at the top of this list. But at the time that this list was compiled, Bulgaria came in at number 1 with 15.4 deaths per 1,000, Ukraine number 2 at 15.2, Latvia 3, Lesotho 4, Lithuania 5, Serbia 6, Croatia 7, Romania 8, Georgia 9, and Russia 10. So I'll pick out a few other countries. The United States had an official death rate of 8.7 per 1,000. The United Kingdom 9.4. India's rate was 7.2. China 7.1. Australia 6.6. Indonesia 6.4. Ireland 6. Turkey 5.4. And the countries that are recorded as having the lowest death rates are the United Arab Emirates at 1.5 and Qatar at 1.2. Now, one of the reasons that the decline in the population is such a concern for China is that they now have an aging population. So let's have a look at the population pyramid, which shows the changes in the population by age group over the course of the last 70 years. So you can see that back in 1950, the population of China was a perfect pyramid. We had a growing birth rate, so therefore the biggest age group was at the bottom, and we had a fairly even split in terms of male and female. Male on the left of this chart in blue and female on the right in red or pink. So let's move forward in 5-year jumps. In 1955, China's birth rate was increasing, so you can see the number of young people is increasing. By 1960, we'd started to see that levelling off. By 1965, there was still a high birth rate, so there was still a predominance of people in the younger age group. By 1970, we had a similar trend. By 1975, we started to see a slowdown in the birth rate. So you can see that the age group between 0 and 4 is actually smaller than the 5 to 9 age group. By 1980, that had become more pronounced, so we'd seen a further slowdown in the birth rate. In 1985, the birth rate had increased slightly, and again in 1990, that had continued. However, by 1995, the birth rate was coming down again. That continued in 2000, continued further in 2005. 2010, we see a narrowing of the pyramid. So we no longer have a pyramid shape. It's not a triangle. It's starting to become a lot more like a cylinder. By 2015, we've got a pronounced slowdown at the bottom of this chart. So it's narrowing in at the bottom. By 2020, that's even more pronounced. So you're starting to see the older age groups between 45 and 60 starting to become the biggest part of the population. And then if we move forward to 2023, you can see the current position. And China now has a very real problem because more than 50% of their population is aged 50 and above, which means that a lot of those people are coming towards the end of their working lives and therefore will contribute less to the economy. And they become more of a burden for the state because the state will have to provide pensions, will have to provide health services, will have to provide facilities to look after these people. And when you look at the top section of this chart, more than 30% of the people are above 65 years of age. So they've actually come to the end of their working lives. So they're already dependent upon the state. And the state obviously needs to take taxes from the working population. But when you look at the shape of this chart, you can see that it's narrowing down the bottom. So as time goes on, if the birth rate continues to be low, that means that the population will continue to decline, and therefore there'll be a smaller working population, therefore smaller taxes. And this is now why there are major concerns about the future of China, because if this carries on, China will become top heavy and it will have a lot of dependents who are relying on a shrinking workforce. As a result in the reduction of the population in China, it's now expected that India will be officially announced as the largest country in the world in 2023. And as we've just looked at the population pyramid for China, I thought it'd be worth comparing what the situation is for India. This chart shows the position in India in 1998. So you can see that at that point, India still had the perfect pyramid shape. So it still had an increasing birth rate, and the largest part of society is the 0 to 4 age bracket. Now, over the last 15 years, things have started to slow down. In 2003, we still had a pyramid shape. By 2008, there was a reduction in the birth rate, so you can see that the 0 to 4 category is no longer the largest. By 2013, that trend had continued. By 2018, we're seeing the shape of the chart changing. And in 2023, you can see that the birth rate has slowed down now. But this is very different to the shape of the China chart. The Chinese chart is top heavy. More than 50% of the population are aged above 50. However, the vast majority of the population in India is aged below 40. So the majority of the population is still at or below working age. And this chart shows a comparison of the projected population for India and China in 2030 and 2040. So if we take a step back and have a look at the overall picture here, the biggest part of the population in India for both years is the 19 to 40 year age bracket. And this is the prime working age. This is when people are most productive. So India is in a very good position. They've got a lot of people coming through the workforce. And in 2030, the second largest group is 0 to 18 years. And that obviously represents future workforce. The third largest group in India is 41 to 60, which obviously still have a lot of working life in them. And the smallest group is the 60 plus. However, when you look at the situation with China, it's almost the exact opposite. The smallest group currently, and projected to be the smallest group by 2040, is the 0 to 18 year group. So that means that there are fewer younger people. The future workforce will be smaller. The largest group currently is the 41 to 60 year age group, which obviously still have some working life in them. But the biggest group by 2040 is the 60 plus group. And that represents a problem because a lot of those people will be retiring and will be relying upon the Chinese state to support them. So this chart shows that not only will India be overtaking China in terms of the number of people, but they're also in a much better position in terms of being able to grow economically because they've got a lot of people who are at the right age or who will be at the right age over the next 10 to 20 years to grow the economy of India. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because what's happening in China right now is a major concern. China is the second largest economy in the world, and it was originally forecast to overtake the USA at some point in the next 2 to 3 years. But whether or not China will take over as the largest economy in the world remains to be seen. And what we've seen in today's video is that there are some fundamental issues going on right now in China that could cause them major problems. We saw that GDP in 2022 was the lowest for any year since 1976, if we exclude the COVID pandemic, which really was an anomaly. And 3% GDP for China is significantly lower than what the country has been achieving historically. And when you look at the trend, there has been a significant downward trend over the course of the last 10 years or so. So the writing is on the wall in terms of the Chinese slowdown. But when you look at the details beneath that, the main driver of the Chinese economy over the last 20 years has been the property sector. And the property sector is in tatters at the moment in China. The property developers are struggling to find cash to be able to build out all of the apartment buildings that they started over the last few years. That's led to a direct fall in confidence in the market because all of the buyers who are waiting for delivery of those apartments are now losing confidence. They're watching prices coming down month on month for the last 8 months. And so everybody is now running scared and demand for property is falling in China. And at the same time as that's happening, we're seeing a decline in the population. And this is going to cause China some major problems over the course of the next 20 to 30 years because a lot of people are aging, they're less productive, so they're not generating any GDP. And so when you look at what's happening right now and combine that with the longer term trend, there are some major challenges coming up for the Chinese economy. And then just to add some current source on top of that, we've had the removal of all of the zero tolerance COVID restrictions that have been in place for the last 3 years. COVID cases have started to increase dramatically. It's been reported that 60,000 deaths have been officially recorded in China. However, there's some question marks as to whether or not that is an official figure. And I've seen some reports recently whereby doctors have been discouraged from putting COVID down as the official cause of death on death certificates. So we don't know what the exact figure is, but it's likely to be rising right now. And we've got the Chinese New Year celebrations. And what that means is that everybody goes back to the areas that they're from. They mix with all of their friends and family, and then they go back to work. So it's likely that cases will continue rising over the next month or two, and that's likely to also impact on productivity at the start of 2023 as people won't be available for the workforce. So there are some major issues going on in China right now, both immediately, in the medium term, and the long term. So as always, I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they happen. If you've liked what I've said today, then please give me a thumbs up. And thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end.